Hi, I'm Ari, I'm the Oak Witch, and in today's video I'm going to be giving some plant magic book recommendations. The first video I did of this, I actually did quite a while ago now, and to be honest, since then I've just read more books and I have better recommendations for you, so I figured I'd do a part 2. Like with any book recommendations, a book can only really teach you so much, and it's basically just trying to give you an introduction into a magical practice, and the best way you will learn is through experience. And I find that the best witchy occult books are the ones that sort of help you step into gaining that experience. They help you in ways that will actually enrich your magical practice, and that's the books that I'm kind of giving you as a recommendation in today's video. Starting with Occult Botany, Sédir's Concise Guide to Magical Plants by Paul Sédir, translated, edited and annotated by R. Bailey. Now this is quite a big book, it's a hardback as well. I'm pretty sure it only comes in a hardback, and it is a really lovely encyclopedic guide to magical plants. So what this book is actually a translation of a 1902 French book by Paul Sédir. Of course, it was all about occult herbalism, and the author was actually quite influential in the occult revival in France. Paul Sédir was a very prominent occultist. He was a member of many initiatory orders, and this book kind of acted as a textbook for his students all about occult herbalism, and there's a bunch of topics which he goes over in here. So this book is actually split into 3 parts, with the first part being all about the plant kingdom, and this involves things like phytogenesis, physiology, physiognomy. Part 2 of this book, he actually goes over the relationship that humans have with plants. So he discusses like base recipes for medicinal like herbalism, and he goes over different types of magics with plants, with nature, and he goes over generally just plant mysticism. With part 3 of the book, which is the significant portion of the book, which is basically a dictionary of magical plants. Most people are quite familiar with Cunningham's Encyclopedia of Magical Herbs, where he kind of has an encyclopedia of different plants laid out in this format. There's many books like this now. This book follows a similar format where there is different profiles of certain plants, and under these plants there's a list of different things about them and the correspondences for the use in magic. Honestly, I think this is actually much more useful in terms of correspondences than Cunningham's book. Cunningham was obviously a Wiccan, and it's very neo-pagan in its correspondences, whereas this feels much more like occult correspondences. They're a bit more adaptable in the sense that these correspondences can appeal to a wider audience, so different magical practitioners can get a lot out of the correspondences listed here, whereas this can feel a bit neo-pagan specific, if that kind of makes sense. So for example, under a plant he gives the Latin name, he gives the different French names, there's the elemental qualities, there's the ruling planet, zodiacal signature, and then the occult properties. Under the occult properties part, there is information about the herb in terms of its medicinal usage, there is medicinal actions of the plants, there is sometimes a little bit of folklore and historical usages of these plants as well, sometimes listed under certain plants. And obviously, just like Cunningham's book, you get the sort of fine line drawings next to each plant. So I think it's really great in that, you know, it's formatted really beautifully and it's so easy to use in your magical practice. If you're sitting at your altar, you're about to do a spell and you need to just double check some correspondences, go into a book. Books like these are always so helpful, and I think this is kind of stands out because of the occult correspondences, and it's just really interesting. Obviously, as I discussed in terms of the first 2 parts of the book, there's a lot of just key information here which is really interesting. For example, tables of elemental signatures and zodiacal signatures, which kind of links to the correspondences that he talks about later in the book. There's information on planetary signatures and how to tell whether certain plants are dominated by certain planets. Just really interesting information to pair with like a really useful dictionary. So I honestly think this book is great. To give a fair critique, obviously it is a hardback. Hardbacks tend to be a bit more expensive. The accessibility of actually being able to ID the plants with these images, just like Cunningham's, obviously they're not really that great for being able to tell what the plant actually looks like. It's just a fine line drawing. Beautiful drawings, but they're not actually really great for ID. But you wouldn't really use a book like this for IDing. You would use an actual ecology book, field guide, ID book. There's plenty of those. And in my first video of this series, I actually discussed about how important getting an ID and field guide book is for your magical practice, and just wanted to reinforce that tip in this one as well. But yeah, I think this is such a good book to have on any witches or occultists bookshelf. Really, really useful. The next book I'm going to recommend is 13 Pathways of Occult Herbalism by Daniel A. Schulke. This book is a 3-hands press release and it is so beautiful. A lot smaller than the previous book I recommended, very short, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's a fast-paced read. It's still quite a medium-paced, slow-paced, depending on your reading capability read. But it is a beautiful book and it is quite useful. So the whole structure of this book is to outline ways in which you can approach herbs, plants in your occult practice or magical practice. So in the first half he gives these 13 pathways, these 13 routes into approaching plant magic, and they include things like, you know, he discusses cleansing practices and he discusses ways of applying that herbal knowledge to your body and practice. He discusses things like, you know, stepping outside of just books and learning from experience. So he also goes over studying ecology as a way in which to enrich your plant magic practice. It's a lot of advice and a lot of practical ways to approach occult herbalism, plant magic. And he gives like specific names for the different pathways as well, which I won't go over because they're a bit fancy and there's 13 of them. But the second half of the book is then also kind of going further into what he calls esoteric plant knowledge, and he actually gives a sort of comparative analysis of the ways in which different traditions, cultural practices approach plant magic, and I thought that was really, really interesting. Obviously this is a beautiful book. The cover is gorgeous. On the inside there's lovely drawings and it's formatted really lovely. It's just a really lovely book to look at. I would say it's kind of for advanced practitioners or just non-beginners. It's difficult because the book is structured around this idea of helping you, you know, giving advice to approaching plant magic and, you know, how to step into enriching your plant magic through these different routes. So that kind of does feel a bit like of a beginner topic, but the way he writes is a bit more flowery, a bit more like poetic language. It's not always accessible to a lot of people who are reading witchy books for the first time, or just reading any form of like non-fiction for the first time. If you're not really used to that type of books writing, then sometimes people can struggle with stuff like this. But I wouldn't say it's massively inaccessible, but it's just the way he writes. It kind of feels like it caters a lot more for people who already have base knowledge on specific things that he mentions. I say it's for advanced practitioners because there's not a lot of base explanation on really simple concepts, which a lot of beginners do, because obviously it's introducing you to a lot of different topics, so you need to expand on what you're talking about. A lot of the things he brings it up in a way in which he assumes you have prior knowledge of that particular topic. So that's why I don't think it's necessarily a beginner book, because a beginner won't have that prior knowledge. So I wouldn't necessarily say this should be your first book on plant magic, but it definitely is a really, really interesting one. Hence why I want to recommend it, and recommend something for people who perhaps don't want to just read another basic beginner book. You might be interested in this one. The next book I want to recommend, I unfortunately don't have a physical copy of. I wish that I did, but I read it through Scribd, and it is The Revolutionary Genius of Plants, A New Understanding of Plant Intelligence and Behaviour by Stefano Mancuso. So this book isn't necessarily an esoteric or occult book. It is more of an ecological scientific book, which kind of goes through how we can view plants differently in accordance to their intelligence. If anyone's ever seen David Attenborough's The Green Planet docuseries, which is really good by the way, this book kind of follows that format in terms of helping the reader understand plants differently. So this book kind of goes over the science behind a lot of different behaviours that certain plants across the globe do and have evolved to do. So the book kind of prefaces this idea of how we understand intelligence, and a lot of people sort of think humans as a species as the most intelligent because of, I don't know, self-awareness or things that make humans quite distinct in accordance to other animals. But we don't really tend to look at plants as intelligent. We tend to look at plants as commodities or resources at our disposal, and that's it. But this book kind of challenges that idea. For example, this book kind of goes through the ways that plants have adapted to their environment to survive, and also looks at things like mimicry, so specific plants such as what we call the living stones. And these are plants that are found in dry areas of Namibia and South Africa, and they have evolved and adapted to mimic stones. Each chapter kind of goes over like a phenomenon, so mimesis, or plants moving without muscles, or having memory without a brain, and he gives examples of specific plants and kind of goes into detail on how this plant does this and why this plant does this and the way it's adapted to do this, and sort of those different theories and explanations. And it's just thoroughly interesting, really interesting. It's the kind of book I really wish I had a physical copy of to show you guys and to even see myself. But the downside is that it is, I think, a hardback book, and it is like £20 that I've seen online, and it's a lot of money. The positive side is that it is on Scribd, so that's how I read it, and much more accessible in that way. But yeah, one of those books where it's a bit expensive, but I honestly think it's probably one of those books that is worth it. I really look forward to getting a physical copy eventually. What I really liked is there's also mentions of environmental concerns that people may not really realise about. So, for example, one of the many negative effects of climate change is the increase in soil salinity. So as the sea levels are rising, this means that the land is becoming more salty through sort of freshwater aquifers or from, you know, coastal regions. And when the land gets more salty, this can lead to numerous negative things, but one of the things we as humans are facing is global annual losses in agriculture production as a result. But of course it affects the plants, and it can have knock-on effects on mammals, etc, etc. So it is really interesting to see this book kind of go over those concerns, and honestly I think it's written in a really accessible way. Sometimes reading these sciencey books can get a little bit overwhelming for those who aren't used to reading research, academic papers, or just any sort of science-based book. Some people, you know, a lot of people aren't really used to it. And I think this book kind of writes about this ecological science in a really accessible way, feels very sort of friendly to the layperson. So I would definitely say that this is a really valuable read. And I bring up a book like this because, quite honestly, the way we approach plants and the relationships we have with them, it can be really strengthened by learning about ecology. And ecology isn't just like learning about where the plant is native to, very useful, but it can go into a lot more of this expanded approach, looking into the actual ecological behaviour of the plant, the way it's adapted and how it adapts to its environment. And honestly, I think this book can really help you give a new approach to how we actually look at plants, the way we treat them as living things, as things that are intelligent, and it can be so useful in your plant magic practice. So the next book I'm going to recommend is Under the Bramble Arch by Corrine Boyer. I have spoken about this book before, and I just wanted to give an official recommendation because honestly this is such a lovely book. This book is a Troy Books release. It is beautiful cover, it's really lovely on the inside as well, the way it's formatted, pictures in the middle, and just really lovely to look at and to read. The formatting is really lovely as well. There's kind of line drawings throughout, and her writing is quite, you know, friendly. Really enjoy reading this book. So this book actually follows a more folk witchcraft approach, and I think a lot of people are sort of more interested in that type of witchcraft nowadays, so I think this is definitely appealing in that sense. But what makes this book actually really unique is the plants that she covers, and she covers pretty much what we call weeds but what even is a weed anyway, but like wayside plants. Everyday plants that you see on the side of a road in the cracks of the pavement, or, you know, what people tend to dig up out of their garden. Those type of plants that are, you know, really, really accessible, really common, and wayside plants. And she kind of goes over them chapter by chapter, discussing each plant in depth, and really interesting. It kind of feels like the author's own personal, like, herbal grimoire in that sense, and that's just really, really cool. Under each plant chapter, she'll start with basic ecological information. She gives kind of folk history in terms of like folk names or any sort of folklore. She then goes over basic information about folk medicine, history of the folk medicine, and her own personal practices, which is very interesting. It's kind of nice in that sense. I said before, it kind of feels like her own personal grimoire. There's a lot of personal practices, recipes, and experiences that she gives and she writes about in this book. So it is kind of nice that you're reading a book from someone's experience directly. That feels like really useful and really applicable. So she then talks about charms and spells as well, and she does this for each plant. And the type of plants that she talks about, for example, like thistles or tansies or teasel, English ivy, plantain and stinging nettles. So these weeds, wayside, really common plants. And you know, I think a book like this is so good because, quite honestly, it's much more accessible, much more budget friendly, and much more friendly for people who are not really open about their witchcraft practice. Because honestly, a lot of the time when you get these plant magic books, or even just spell books or general witchcraft books that kind of give these spell ideas, and these are for the beginner witch, and there's like these spells and charms or remedies that have all these different plants that, you know, you've never even heard of before, or, you know, as a beginner you've never heard of before, or you just don't have a cupboard full of all these plants. And it kind of reinforces that mindset that you have to go out and buy those things in order to practice those spells and to try it out. And of course you want a book, as a beginner or as any magical practitioner, you want a book that you can apply to your own practice. Those are the books that will be useful and helpful for you and will actually advance your magical practice. Ones that you can actually apply the information within. What I do find quite unhelpful are books that do list all these different plants, that, and especially when you're reading a book from an author that doesn't even live in the same country as you. I find that in particular, as someone who lives in the UK, and, you know, a lot of the magical and witchcraft books now are written by United States authors, and it's not necessarily a bad thing inherently, but of course that is the perspective the author's writing from. That's the experience that they have living in the United States. So a lot of the books are very US centric, and it's not very applicable to me, so I'm sure a lot of people can relate. So what I find with plant magic books, with spell books that list all these different herbs and plants to get, is that, you know, you look at that and you think, well, I'm just not gonna buy a whole bunch of plants that I have to order from online that will have loads of travel miles to reach to me, which is not very environmentally friendly if we think about it, just to practice this one spell in this beginner book. It's not very accessible. So I think a book like this, where it's literally just looking at the plants around you, you could step outside and you could probably see a weed that you can use in your craft, and that kind of mindset I think is so much more accessible and friendly for a beginner, hence why I really, really love this book. So of course this is biased to the author, who kind of gives information about, you know, American folklore and, you know, UK folklore. So she obviously does have some bias to her own experience and her own practice, and what I would say is probably very just Northern Hemisphere based in terms of the plants, right? But the type of thinking this book can help inspire you to do is really, really useful and really helpful. And I really enjoyed this book for that just really grounded, down to earth, local approach to your plant magic witchcraft practice. As well, in terms of accessibility, something else I just thought of, it sort of reinforces the idea you don't have to live out in the countryside to practice plant magic. and have it be local. Obviously there are weeds and common plants and wayside plants, all these types of plants in urban areas too. There's loads in urban areas. So it is one of those things that can be really useful. And this book is actually the first or the second of a trilogy of books. So I think the first one is Under the Witching Tree, which I do have a copy of, but I haven't actually read this one yet. But just thought I'd bring it up because as a pair, they look very, very lovely. I don't actually know what the third book is, so who knows what that is, but just thought I'd mention it. And the next book I'm going to recommend is Blackthorn's Botanical Magic, The Green Witch's Guide to Essential Oils for Spellcraft, Ritual and Healing by Amy Blackthorn. If this is familiar to anyone, it's because I have recommended this before in a prior video, but I have since taken that video down. So I wanted to recommend this officially again because I do think this is helpful for beginners and should go under a plant magic video, right? So this book kind of again goes over that encyclopedia format of having sort of plant profiles and different correspondences for the plant, and then she'll go over the use of the plant, maybe a little bit of history here and there, and then she gives recipes and spells for using that plant. But the way that this book is structured is all about essential oil. So it's plant magic specifically in essential oil form. Now, a couple things I want to say. One, essential oils have quite a large resource footprint. So essential oils use up quite a lot of plants in order to make the essential oil. So they're not always the most sustainably sourced in terms of a product. So there are some environmental concerns, and I do wish she touched on that a little bit more in this book. I mean, she, at the end, she gives resources for ethically sourced essential oils, and she does go over safety concerns. She goes over all that sort of stuff of how to properly use essential oils and the myths of essential oils that people have. So she goes over the safety and precautions in that sense, and I really, really appreciate that about this. But there are environmental concerns for ethically sourcing a lot of witchy ingredients, not just essential oils, crystals, which I did an article on my website, and just general plants in general. So maybe I'll do a video on that. If you guys want that video, let me know below. But I wish you touched on that more here, because I do think it's an important issue. But alas. But the environmental concerns I appreciated that she did talk about is the concept of over-harvesting of certain plants. So she talks about white sage and palo santo, which I did a video on those two if you would like to watch that. And she also talks about dragon's blood. So she does talk about some environmental concerns, which I did really appreciate. In saying that, I'm recommending this book because, like I said in the video I recommended this on before, I do think essential oils are quite accessible for a lot of people in terms of actually applying the use of essential oils. When you're making spell oils, it is very, very simple. You need your base oil and you need the essential oil and, you know, the relative dilution ratio, but it's just putting in your essential oil into the carrier oil, and that is your oil done, as opposed to the raw plant material and you're waiting weeks for that to process, and then there's a bit more to that process. But for a lot of people, essential oils can be more accessible. It's especially a really good low energy option. Any witches with depression who sort of need more simple methods to perform magic, you know, I think essential oils are really good for that as well. So, you know, I do think essential oils are quite accessible. Plus, they're usually quite mainstream, at least here in the UK. You can find essential oils on any high street. For example, in Holland and Barrett, they sell essential oils. So it is something which is quite easily found. And they can be quite budget friendly for a lot of people. Just be careful with where you're buying from. She goes over all those precautions of buying essential oils and what to look out for, and yeah, just be careful. But she goes over this, which I really, really appreciated that she did. So, but other than that, you know, this is a really useful book in terms of the magical information she gives about specific plants and their profiles. So on a plant, she gives scientific name and ecological information. She gives correspondences, so the element, day of the week magical uses, planetary and astrology signatures, and she even talks about deities. She gives specific warnings for each essential oil, which is quite lovely. So, you know, there's a lot of information in here, and of course, you know, the information is not specific to the plant in essential oil form. You can use those correspondences as the plant in general. So yeah, I honestly think this is a really useful book. I think this is a really pretty book as well, and just really useful. It's something which I definitely go back to a lot of the time in my practice when I'm looking at making new oils, when I want inspiration for certain oil blends which she gives in here, you know, really good stuff. The last book I am going to recommend to you is Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge and the Teachings of Plants by Robin Wall Kimmerer. So again, I've spoken about this book quite a few times on my channel, and I wanted to officially recommend it here in this video. So another book I don't have a physical copy of, I really want one, I just haven't gotten around to buying one, to be honest. But I definitely am going to, because it's a book I really want on my shelf to read through in my own time. And it's just a really lovely book. So obviously I don't have a physical copy, so I don't know how physically big it is, but the audiobook of it was like 28 hours long or something, and the ebook is also quite big, so it's one of those books you will take your time to go through, especially as the content can be quite heavy as well. So it is something that I found myself processing over a sort of longer period of time and really going over the information and reflecting on it, and it's not really a book you're going to rush through, but it is a really beautiful book, and the audiobook is actually voiced by the author, which made that so much more special to listen to. A lot of the stories that she talks about in terms of, you know, obviously her own Indigenous background and her own approach to plants as a botanist, as an Indigenous person, as someone who combines those two things together and doesn't see them as mutually exclusive. And you know, the stories she gives about her own experiences, her own life experiences, they're both heartbreaking and heartwarming, and listening to the author's own voice, almost like talking to you, like a discussion, telling you these stories, was really wonderful. And I can't recommend listening to the audiobook enough. It's actually really beautiful, so I do recommend that. But also, as I said, I do want a physical copy because it's quite a big book. I think it is also quite useful as well to read through it physically, so whatever I guess you prefer. So as mentioned before, Robin Wall Kimmerer is a botanist, and she's also a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. She is Indigenous, and this book kind of goes over her perspective as an Indigenous person and her relationship to the earth and to plants. It is a really interesting and important perspective, and I recommend this because a lot of my audience is actually from the United States, so I think reading a book like this can actually quite help a lot of people perhaps gain a perspective they hadn't considered before. As well, because this book goes through a lot of history on native suppression, discrimination, the destruction of, you know, language and culture, and honestly hearing about these things and her story in particular was really enlightening. So in the process of learning about environmentalism and conservation, I think it's really important to consider Indigenous perspectives, and I'm a big believer for any conservation approach we need to work with Indigenous communities and support Indigenous communities where applicable. And simply just reading about native perspectives, you know, in a book, for example, such as this, I think can be really helpful in stepping into that. So that's why I really appreciate this book. And it's also just a really insightful book. The way she talks about certain plants, her relationship with them in terms of, you know, her own native perspective. You can feel her connection to them through her words and through her voice in the audiobook. And, you know, when she talks about ecological science, she makes it very accessible and very personal. And I think that's really lovely. A lot of science books, and when we're looking at ecological science, it can feel quite objective, and it's meant to be unbiased and objective because that's just science. But what I loved about this book is that she kind of blends both this Indigenous wisdom and the science of these plants together, and I think that is just so interesting and so moving for me as well as an animist, as someone who has a background, you know, outside of my internet life. in ecology and environmentalism, I too see them as, you know, not mutually exclusive. Both how I view the natural world in terms of ecology and science, and how I view it as an animist, as a magical practitioner, I don't think they're two distinct things. I think they definitely intertwine and help each other out, and in that sort of symbiotic relationship. So I do really think that this book can offer that approach as well, and it's just really interesting. And those are the books I'm recommending to you today. Are there any books which you've read before? Are there any that really stand out to you that you want to read? Let me know down below. Like I said before at the start of the video, honestly, enriching your plant magic practice will involve experience. And books are great, and they can definitely teach you a lot of things, but experience will be your greatest teacher. But I also find that books that really help you with your experience are the ones which, you know, will definitely help advance your practice further. So it's about finding the books that really help you get off your butt and start practicing. So I really like books like that, and these books have helped me do that, so that's why I'm recommending them to you today. Thank you so much for watching, and again, if you want me to do a video on ethically sourcing witchcraft ingredients, do let me know. I'd love to see what you guys maybe think. If that's interesting to you, I can do a video on that. And if there's any other videos you want me to do, please feel free to send a little comment suggestion down below. I would really appreciate it. So yeah. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.